This is a GCSE chemistry tutorial within topic 10. This video will focus on potable water. In this video we will look at what is meant by potable water, we will look at describing 3 methods of obtaining potable water, and we will evaluate the positives and negatives of those 3 methods. So what do we mean by potable water? Well, potable water is water that is safe to drink. This means it has low levels of dissolved salts and low levels of microbes in it. It's important to note that potable water is not the same as pure water, as most drinking water contains some dissolved salts in it. Pure water, on the other hand, has no dissolved salts. It is a pure solution and not a mixture. In the UK, most of our potable water comes from fresh water. This is collected by rainwater, which dissolves some gases from the air as it falls to the ground. The rainwater then collects underground, where it's known as groundwater. It collects in lakes, in rivers, and all of these are known as freshwater. If rainwater collects on the ground, it is known as surface water. So we've got surface water on the surface, groundwater underground, and it can also collect into lakes and rivers. The source of the fresh water depends on where you live in the UK. In order to turn fresh water into potable water, we first need to choose an appropriate source of fresh water. We then filter it, passing it through filter beds. This removes any sand and gravel layers that are in the water. After the water has been filtered, it then needs to be sterilised in order to kill off any microbes or microorganisms living in it. This sterilisation can be done in 3 ways. First of all, we can add chlorine gas to it, we could add ozone to it, or we could treat it with UV ultraviolet light. All of these will sterilise the water as they will kill off any bacteria and microbes. All 3 of these are known as sterilising agents. However, freshwater supplies can be limited, for example in very hot and dry countries. This means that we might need to use salt water. You can't drink salt water because it is toxic to you. It will make you throw up. In order to make fresh water into potable water, we need to desalinate it, to remove the salt. Desalination can be done in one of 2 ways. First of all, we could use distillation, as we looked at in the separation techniques video. Or we could use membranes, sometimes known as reverse osmosis. We will look at both of these methods in turn. Before we carry out desalination, we first check the pH of the water using a pH meter. If the pH is too high or too low, we can then neutralise it first using titrations. We also need to check that we have sodium chloride. To do this, we carry out a flame test on the sodium to find a yellow flame, and then secondly we can carry out a test to check that we have chloride ions, adding in silver nitrate and forming a white precipitate, as we looked at in the triple only topic of testing for ions. The first method of desalination is distillation. This is where we boil off the water and then condense it in order to end up with pure distilled water. This separates out the mixtures due to different boiling points. Our salt is then left behind. The second method of desalination is by using membranes. This is sometimes known as the reverse osmosis method. In this, we have our salt water, so our water that contains our dissolved sodium chloride, and will also contain contaminants. We apply a pressure to it, which forces it to travel through the semi-permeable membrane. By forcing it through this semi-permeable membrane, this allows the water through but prevents the salt from going through as well. It will also remove a large number of the contaminants. So we've got our salt water on the left-hand side of our semi-permeable membrane and then our fresh water on the right-hand side. Desalination, however, is not often used. This is because both of these methods, distillation and reverse osmosis, require lots of energy. This comes because in distillation we need energy to boil the water, and in reverse osmosis we need energy to pressurize the water. Because they use lots of energy, this makes them expensive, so desalination is rarely used. Because of urban lifestyles, as well as industrial processes and farming, we produce a large amount of wastewater. This water must be treated before it is released back into the environment. When we treat this wastewater, we need to remove any organic matter and any harmful microbes that are present. This includes water that is used in industrial processes, for example in the harbour process. So how does sewage treatment work? Well, first of all, we need to carry out filtration. This is done via the process of screening. This removes any large solid particles, for example grit, by passing the sewage through a screen. This also removes any large bits of material, for example twigs or plastic bags. Our second stage is sedimentation, which happens in a settlement tank. In this, the heavier particles sink to the bottom to form a sediment, and the lighter particles stay on the top, forming the liquid part, which is the effluent. This heavier sediment is known as sewage sludge. In the next two steps, we will look at what happens to this effluent as well as what happens to this sewage sludge. First of all, the sewage sludge is broken down by microorganisms in the absence of oxygen, so this is anaerobic digestion. The sewage sludge is dried before it is broken down. This removes any organic matter. It also produces biogas, which we can use to make electricity. The dried sludge can also be used as fertiliser. The effluent, which if you remember is the liquid part, is aerobically digested. So this is broken down by microorganisms in the presence of oxygen. So we have anaerobic for the sewage sludge and aerobic for the effluent. This removes any organic matter as well as harmful microbes. In order for this effluent to re-enter the potable water banks, what we need is to then treat it for any additional toxic substances. So we might add chemicals in order to precipitate out the metals. We can carry out UV radiation or use additional membranes to clean this. We will then re-add chlorine to kill off the microorganisms. In this video, we've looked at 3 ways to obtain potable water. First of all, we looked at getting potable water from freshwater supplies or groundwater. We looked at the desalination of salt water, and we looked at the treatment of sewage and agricultural waste. Each of these has both positives and negatives. For freshwater, we need to carry out filtration and sterilisation, which means it requires sterilising agents as well as filtration equipment. Desalination requires distillation or reverse osmosis, but takes a large amount of energy to do, regardless of which one we choose. And then we have treatment of wastewater, where we need to do screening, sedimentation and digestion, both aerobic and anaerobically. This is several steps and requires a large specialised treatment plant. One thing that both AQA and Edexcel want you to do is to compare these methods. So getting our water from freshwater is the easiest, it has the least equipment, uses the least amount of energy and costs the least. The hardest one is desalination, as it requires a lot of energy to do, regardless of if we use distillation or reverse osmosis. Finally, we have the wastewater, which is the moderate one. It's in the middle. It requires a large amount of specialist equipment, but significantly less energy than is needed for desalination. That concludes this tutorial video on potable water. In the next two videos, which will be the last two videos in the Chemistry GCSE series, we will look over the Haber process as well as NPK fertilisers.